From the annals of human history, only a few have been able to outlive their time on this earth by feats of human stamina, tactical genius, and will to survive in the most hopeless of circumstances. These are personalities chiseled not by any victory alone, but by defiance against mortal danger continuously. These personalities, sculpted not by victory alone, but by unyielding defiance against mortal danger, left a certain mark on the world around them. Though differing in their circumstances, it would be an overriding affinity that linked their stories, refusal to yield to the battle trials of the person. From the steppes of merciless Mongolia to the frozen battlefields of Finland, from the ways of ancient Carthaginian warfare to sweeping naval engagements during the Napoleonic era, these men would become legends, not just for triumph, but because of their ability to endure when death was apparently inevitable. Mad Jack Churchill. Of course, in the midst of this backdrop, gunfires and thunder of artillery, one figure became conspicuous. This was one who looked somewhat out of place in that period, with nothing like a modern rifle but instead a broadsword, a longbow, and a set of bagpipes. Major Jack Churchill strode with ease through the bedlam of World War II, seemingly unwitting that the wars of medieval knights had ended. His contemporaries knew him as Mad Jack, for good reason. While his comrades were dependent upon automatic weapons and modern tactics, Jack drew ancient instruments of war, instruments that he used to carve his name into history. It was in 1940, during the retreat at Dunkirk, that Jack Churchill would make one of his most iconic appearances. While the British Expeditionary Force was desperately trying to get themselves evacuated in the face of overwhelming advances by the German army, Churchill had other plans. He was attached to the Manchester Regiment and showed no signs of flight. He moved closer to the French village of L'Épinette. The fog of war was heavy in the air, and his men watched with utter incredulity as Churchill calmly drew his longbow, an ancient weapon that had seen action in countless wars centuries before. As the Germans approached, Churchill released an arrow, and a Nazi officer fell, his the only recorded longbow kill of the entire war. That was no desperate flinging of an arrow by a man clutching at ancient traditions. Jack Churchill had spent years perfecting the use of the longbow. Indeed, his expertise went even beyond actual combat. He had competed for Britain in archery before the war, and this skill with his medieval weapon became yet another part of his unorthodox armament. But it wasn't just the bow that made him different. When he wasn't felling enemies with silent arrows, Churchill charged into battle with claymore, his Scottish broadsword slung across his back. A man brandishing a sword in the midst of mechanized warfare would have seemed surreal to anyone but Churchill, who believed that any officer who goes into action without his sword is improperly dressed. With his sword drawn, the steel gleaming and flickering light from explosions, he more than once led his troops directly into the heart of enemy lines. It was as if his mere presence was denial of the logic of modern warfare. Perhaps most astonishing of Churchill's escapades is the 1943 attack on the heavily fortified German-held town of Salerno in Italy. As the Allied forces prepared their attack, Churchill placed himself at the head of his commando unit. But before the sound of gunfire, something far more unexpected hung in the air, the mournful hum of bagpipes. Jack stood in defiance, piping the tune of "Will Ye No Come Back Again" on his bagpipes, the music cutting through the tension like a blade. As the last notes of the melody died away, he heaved a grenade into the enemy lines and yelled the order to charge. Salerno would not be the last time such an apparently reckless method was performed by Churchill, which had sent the enemy in shock and utter confusion. In perhaps one of the more fantastical tales of war, Churchill would come to gain the Distinguished Service Order. He led an incursion into the Yugoslavian island of Brac against a German garrison in 1944, with his sword at his side and his bagpipes blowing the charge as he and his men poured over the island's defences. The fighting was getting hot, with the German forces seeking to encircle his commandos, but Churchill kept rallying his men, blowing into his pipes. But the war was unforgiving, and his luck finally seemed to run out when the Germans launched a behemoth of a counterattack. Out of ammunition and against insurmountable odds, Churchill was knocked unconscious by a mortar shell and taken prisoner by German forces. For many, that would have been the end. Not so for Jack Churchill, however. The Germans were stumped by this strange figure, who fought with ancient weapons and shipped him to the Sachsenhausen concentration camp. Not even captivity could break Churchill's will. With a compatriot fellow prisoner, he pulled an audacious escape. Using a tunnel, the two men outsmarted their captors and ran away from the concentration camp, traveling at night and hiding in cover during the day. For over 100 miles they went until recaptured near the Baltic coast. For most men, that would have spelled finis, but not for Churchill. Transferred to another camp in Austria, immediately Churchill began to plan another breakout. An Allied bombing raid at the beginning of April 1945 saw the guards abandon their posts, and he slipped away. He simply walked out of the camp. Over the next several weeks, he trekked over mountains and through valleys to reach the safety of the advancing American forces. Major Jack Churchill lived through several near-death experiences on the field without even once portraying fear from war's dangers. Perhaps the most astounding fact about his story is that upon his release, Churchill was ready to return to the battlefield. He was dispatched to Burma to fight against the Japanese, but before he could see action once more, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki brought World War II to a sudden close. To this, Tavos reports Churchill as saying, "If it wasn't for those damn Yanks, we could have kept the war going another 10 years." After the war, no less colourful turns would Churchill's life take. Having mastered another medieval weapon surfing, he would emigrate to Australia and begin popularising this sport in Britain, thus getting yet another peculiar title, Father of British Surfing. Yet over time, it would seem that Churchill, larger than life upon the battlefield, never quite found satisfaction in a world which had moved on from war. But what fueled him to fight with the tools of the past, to face modern warfare as though it still were the age of knights and archers? What inner fire burned in him, one which captivity itself could not quench? That's a question nobody has ever had to answer. The war was over, but did Jack Churchill ever stop longing for one more fight? Giovanni Battista Belzoni. It is in the burning deserts of Egypt, amidst the golden sands and ancient ruins, that Giovanni Battista Belzoni made history. At 6 feet 7 inches high, with the frame of a giant, this giant of an explorer towered above most men, a far cry from all explorers before him. Still, it was not the stature that made him the stuff of legend, but audacity. A one-time circus strongman, Belzoni would become one of the most fearsome adventurers of the 19th century, a man who could match his wits against the secrets of ancient Egypt and survive perils that killed lesser souls. It was not from any long-held scholarly passion, however, that Belzoni gained entry into the world of Egyptology, but rather from a combination of fate and misfortune. A professional engineer, Belzoni had come to Egypt in 1815, expecting to gain employment with the now dominant Muhammad Ali Pasha, for whom he wished to introduce a new hydraulic water-lifting contraption. However, the Pasha had told him that there was no need for such a contraption, since the irrigation system of the Nile was already well managed. Any success of Belzoni's aims in Egypt appeared to have flown out the window until an extraordinary opportunity showed up. Henry Salt, the British consul in Cairo, had been on a mission of recovery of Egypt's ancient relics to British museums. The man for the task required not only intelligence to oversee the task, but physical strength to move some of the largest statues ever created by human hands. Belzoni was just that man with his knowledge of mechanics and brute force. He soon undertook that work, which would define his legacy. Retrieving the colossal bust of the great pharaoh Ramses II from the sands of Thebes, an exercise which many thought impossible. The challenge was enormous. The huge granite head, weighing over 7 tons, had lain buried for millennia, half sunk in the sand close to the Ramesseum, the great mortuary temple of Ramses II. Belzoni contrived a system of wooden rollers and levered pulleys by simple but efficacious engineering methods, and against all the odds, succeeded in moving the great head across the desert and down the Nile to Cairo, whence it was shipped to London's British Museum, where it remains to this day. This not only showed the skills of Belzoni as an engineer, but also initiated his great career in Egypt. The adventures of Belzoni were, however, far from the sterile world of museum collections. He actually went deep inside the tombs and pyramids and was often at great personal risk. In the year 1817, he made one of his most famous discoveries. The tomb of the pharaoh Seti I in the Valley of the Kings was named as the Belzoni tomb in his name, and was one of the most magnificent tombs ever found. Below, in its depths, Belzoni was one of the very first modern explorers to view, in color, the colorful wall paintings, fresh with color after millennia. He was amazed at the minute and vast scale of Seti's burial site. He recorded its details down to the last minutest of points. But his expertise in the art of discovery was also paralleled by more somber forces, the possible tomb robbers, which were always in danger. For centuries, these robbers had terrorized the desert, stealing from Egypt's dead kings in the dead of night. To them, Belzoni was an interloper, and his groups were frequently assaulted. One of the most frightening experiences occurred when he was in Giza attempting to view the inside of the Great Pyramid. He soon found himself sandwiched between a band of marauders and the unrelenting desert, and barely managed to get away alive following a standoff. He was abnormally tall, and what with his lengthened years of acrobatic training in the circus, he had a slightly advantageous edge over others. Yet even then, the risks occurred aplenty. In one such life-and-death incident, the assassin chased Belzoni with the purpose of killing him. It was while traveling through the hazardous country of Nubia in search of antiquities that he learned of a plot to murder him. Local guides had informed him that a rival group of European treasure hunters, jealous of Belzoni's success and daring, had suborned local tribes to ambush him. By quick thinking and sheer determination, however, he managed to evade the trap with his life, even turning the situation to advantage. Instead, near-death experiences seemed to whet the appetite for further resolve in the quest to find more of Egypt's ancient wonders. In his quest, Belzoni went on to explore some of the most inhospitable places on Earth, including the desert temple of Abu Simbel, another colossal monument to Ramses II. The temple, carved into the mountainside, was partly buried by sand. It was Belzoni, however, who disregarded the heat and isolation of that part of the country and labored for months in clearing the entrance. He was finally rewarded for his doggedness together with several other Europeans, the first ever inside its sacred walls. The view of 4 monumental statues of Ramses at the front, as if awaiting to challenge any who dared disturb their sleep, would have been enough to turn most men back. But not Belzoni. Yet this unyielding nature came at a cost. His competitive spirit to reveal Egypt's secrets made for some grueling rivalries, the greatest of them all with French consul Bernardino Drovetti. At one point, the combativeness between the two individuals seemed to degenerate into near-continuous dispute for supremacy. Both wanted the discovery glory and the treasures of Egypt for their respective nations, with Drovetti calling Belzoni a vandal who looted treasures while Belzoni retaliated with charges of betrayal and sabotage. Their rivalry reached such a point that from being about artifacts, it was a dangerous game of survival and politics. Though highly successful in many ways, Belzoni's modus operandi tended to make his approaches pretty contentious. For such delicate artifacts, he was often criticized for handling them roughly, and at times pursuing investigations rather aggressively. He was viewed by many as a treasure hunter, driven by that thrill of the discovery rather than scientific rigor. But Belzoni, ever the showman, remained unapologetic, feeling that end truly justified the means in his work. The more famous Belzoni became, the greater his ambition. He had explored temples, pyramids, and tombs not seen by sunlight for several thousand years, yet the mystery that still defeated him was that of the hidden chambers in the Great Pyramid. Still undeterred by the failures of other attempts, he prepared for what would be the most daring, possibly dangerous expedition he could ever enter upon. What he found, or didn't find, would only deepen the intrigue surrounding this relentless pursuer of Egypt's ancient secrets. Jan Žižka. The battlefield was a place of chaos, blood, and death. Armies clashed with sword, mace, and arrow in a furious storm of violence. It was amidst this brutal theatre that Jan Žižka, a general of extraordinary ability, emerged as one of the most resilient and feared military leaders of the 15th century. Zizka, a man who by all accounts should have been broken by injury and adversity, instead became a symbol of unyielding defiance, leading his forces to victory time and again, even after he was blinded. His career during the Hussite Wars remains one of the most remarkable in military history, a story defined by tactical brilliance, unrelenting willpower, and a refusal to yield even when the darkness of blindness enveloped him. Zizka's early life was shaped by hardship and violence. Born into a minor noble family around 1360 in the Kingdom of Bohemia, modern-day Czech Republic, little is known about his childhood, but he quickly became entangled in the turmoil that defined the region. The early 15th century was a time of religious upheaval in Europe. The teachings of Jan Hus, a reformer who criticized the corruption of the Catholic Church, ignited a powerful movement in Bohemia, eventually leading to the Hussite Wars. Hus was burned at the stake for heresy in 1415, sparking outrage across Bohemia and setting the stage for a revolt that would shake the foundations of medieval Europe. It was in this crucible of conflict that Zizka would forge his legend. By the time the Hussite Wars began in 1419, Zizka was already an experienced soldier, having fought in various conflicts across Europe, including the Battle of Grunwald in 1410, but it was his leadership during the Hussite rebellion that would cement his place in history. He became a leader of the radical Hussite faction known as the Taborites, named after their fortified city of Tabor. These peasants, radical theologians and soldiers formed a militant wing of the Hussite cause, and under Zizka's command they would become a force to be reckoned with. Zizka's brilliance as a tactician set him apart. He understood that his forces, often outnumbered and lacking the heavy cavalry of their enemies, had to rely on ingenuity rather than brute force. One of his most innovative creations was the Wagenburg, or wagon fort. He had his soldiers use armored wagons arranged in a defensive circle, creating a makeshift fortress on the battlefield. These wagons, armed with early firearms, crossbows, and cannons, provided his troops with mobile defensive positions that could be used to devastating effect. The tactic was revolutionary and would become a hallmark of Hussite strategy, enabling them to defeat numerically superior armies. But Zizka's true test came in 1421, during a pivotal siege at the Battle of Kutna-Hora. His right eye had already been severely damaged in previous battles, leaving him partially blind. During the brutal siege, a catastrophic injury claimed his remaining eye. Now completely blind, Zizka faced an unimaginable challenge, leading an army without being able to see. To most, this would have signaled the end of a military career, but Zizka refused to be defeated by his disability. Rather than relinquish his command, Zizka adapted. His intimate knowledge of tactics and terrain allowed him to continue leading his forces with precision. Relying on trusted commanders and scouts to describe the battlefield to him, Zizka's strategic mind remained as sharp as ever. It was during this period of total blindness that some of his most remarkable victories were achieved. He successfully led the Hussites in numerous battles, routing enemies who had expected a crippled leader to falter. In the years that followed, Zizka's name became synonymous with terror to his enemies. His army, composed mostly of peasants and commoners, systematically dismantled armies sent by the Holy Roman Empire and the Catholic Church. Despite being constantly outgunned and outnumbered, Zizka's troops were driven by a fiery religious zeal and an unwavering belief in their cause. The blind general's ability to adapt and innovate continued to play a critical role. He pioneered the use of mobile artillery, using lightweight cannons that could be transported easily, further enhancing the defensive power of his wagon forts. Zizka's leadership was uncompromising. He demanded discipline and ruthlessness, and his soldiers followed him with almost fanatical devotion. Yet, his genius lay not just in his ability to inspire, but in his cold pragmatism. He understood warfare in a way few of his contemporaries did, recognizing the importance of logistics, terrain, and morale. His strategic use of defensive positions, combined with the aggressive mobility of his wagon forts, meant that even in seemingly hopeless situations, he found ways to outmaneuver his enemies. One such moment came in 1424 at the Battle of Malosov. The forces of the Catholic King Sigismund and the Hussites were poised to clash. Zizka, aware of the enemy's superior numbers, set a clever trap. Using a hill to his advantage, he stationed his troops at the top while his cannons and wagons were hidden from view. When Sigismund's forces advanced, they were ambushed by artillery fire from the concealed cannons. The chaos that ensued allowed Zizka's forces to charge down the hill, smashing through the disorganized enemy ranks. The battle was a crushing victory for the Hussites, and Zizka, leading from the front despite his blindness, was once again the architect of triumph. By the end of his life, Jan Žižka had become a figure of near mythic proportions. He had never lost a battle despite the immense odds against him, and his reputation as an invincible commander grew. His enemies, including the armies of the Holy Roman Empire, the Kingdom of Hungary, and the Catholic Church, had thrown everything they had at him, yet Zizka remained unbroken. But the most astonishing part of Zizka's story is not just that he continued to fight. It's that he thrived as a military leader, even after blindness had taken away his sight. His relentless spirit and tactical brilliance allowed him to overcome obstacles that would have destroyed most men. As he faced his final campaigns, the question loomed: how much longer could this blind general continue to defy the impossible? Would the darkness that had consumed his sight eventually consume his legacy as well? Or was there still more for Zizka to achieve in a world that had yet to see the limits of his defiance? Miyamoto Musashi. Standing alone on a mist-shrouded beach at dawn, one figure sliced the air with slow, contrived motions. The whoosh of steel cutting through the air was barely audible above the crashing waves. This was Miyamoto Musashi, a man whose name would come to define the very essence of the samurai spirit. Born in 1584 during the turbulent Sengoku period, Musashi would grow to become Japan's most legendary swordsman. During his lifetime, Musashi fought over 60 duels and was never defeated by his opponents, among whom were some of the most feared warriors of his time. But his was not only a story of brute strength, but one of strategy, survival, and perfection in an admittedly chaotic world. Musashi was born into a world consumed with war. This was the Sengoku period, more commonly known as the Warring States period, a time of constant struggles for preeminence between samurai clans. Musashi, raised in Harima province, had a father who was a skillful swordsman and great martial artist, who, when he was still very young, acquainted his son with the way of the sword. However, Musashi's relations with his father were strained, and he is supposed to have left home while still a boy, on the path of the Ronin a samurai without a master. Musashi's first recorded duel came when he was only 13 years old, against an older and far more experienced swordsman named Arima Kihei. Kihei was a professional teacher of the Shinto Ryu school and a reputed swordsman. When the match began, Musashi attacked his opponent with a cudgel. Kihei, due to his belittling of his opponent, did not expect such ferocity in this young boy's attack. Musashi struck his opponent on the head with one fell swoop, sending Kihei into unconsciousness and killing him shortly thereafter. This first victory set the tone for Musashi's life of ruthless efficiency combined with unconventional tactics. His fighting style soon gained notoriety. He was a master of adaptability, too often setting aside tradition for practicality. While most samurai adhered to rigid schools of swordsmanship, Musashi refused to be bound by dogma. He fought not for honor, but to win, and to do that meant taking every possible advantage. He conducted psychological warfare. He used very unusual weapons or delayed duels to make his opponents nervous. Probably most famous was the tactic of dual swords, an almost unheard of technique in his time. He went into combat with a katana in one hand and a short wakizashi in the other, thus making his style totally unpredictable and incredibly hard to guard against. Probably the most famous duel in which Musashi ever engaged was with another of Japan's most skilled warriors, Sasaki Kojiro, in 1612. Kojiro was equally famous for his mastery with the nodachi, a longsword that afforded him great reach in battle. It was to be fought on Ganryu Island. Typical of Musashi, he showed up late, being rowed out to the island at a slow pace while whittling a wooden sword from an oar. By the time Musashi arrived, his disheveled appearance, coupled with his lateness, sent Kojiro leaping at Musashi with the nodachi. Musashi calmly deflected the attack and struck Kojiro's head with an improvised weapon, a wooden sword that happened to be at hand. At once, Kojiro fell dead. Victory over Kojiro sealed Musashi's fame throughout Japan, but also signaled a turning point in his life. Unbeaten, Musashi started to retire from public dueling. The story goes that he had thought his rivals were no longer good enough to be conquered, and the need for reputation or prestige that had driven him prior had grown numb. Musashi became introspective, focusing more on the refinement of his technique and philosophy rather than seeking out combat. He wandered Japan as a ronin, fighting in battles and perfecting his craft. He developed what he called Niten Ichi Ryu, or the School of Two Swords, an all-inclusive style of martial art focused on his experience with fighting. What separated Musashi from others living in his time, who also knew how to wield a sword, was the fact that his approach was not only in his mastery of the martial arts, but also in his way of thinking about the whole concept of fighting. In 1645, nearing the end of his life, Musashi would write his famous treatise on strategy and martial arts entitled The Book of Five Rings. He provided therein his philosophy of combat, extending really far beyond swordplay. This is the philosophy of battle, according to Musashi, which applies to everything in life, from leadership to craftsmanship. His writing showed the emphasis on flexibility, preparedness, and mental clarity that was necessary to overcome any adversary. In his view, combat was emblematic of life itself, a series of conflicts in which victory depended not on brute strength, but on adaptability and the ability to read one's opponent. But Musashi's life is mysterious on many counts. For all his fame, Musashi remained an elusive figure. Long serving the same master was not in his nature, and he did not live in one place in Japan. According to many narratives, Musashi participated in a number of major battles, for example the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600, in which he took part against the losers, the Toyotomi clan, though details are hazy. It is as if, from then on, he vanished into his meditation, painting, and calligraphy. He was to become just as much a philosopher as he was a warrior. His last years were spent in a cave near Kumamoto, where he completed the Book of Five Rings, and continued teaching his philosophy to the few students who remained. Yet even when his body had started to weaken, his mind still remained rather sharp, constantly considering thoughts on life, death, and fighting. The legend of Miyamoto Musashi grew not only from his undefeated record in duels, but from his mastery over the mind as much as the sword. How could one man have fought in over 60 duels, often outnumbered, and always against the deadliest of opponents, and emerge without so much as a scratch, physically and mentally? Musashi's life, amidst victories, begged many questions. How did he continue to adapt and change when so many other warriors became fixed in ways that led to their defeat? What inner discipline enabled him to face death without shrinking, time and again, when even the greatest of samurai before him had buckled? Perhaps in that quiet cave where he spent his last days, Musashi found answers that only he will ever know. But one question that may always remain is, did his true mastery lie over the sword, or was it something far deeper? With these actions, one lone man, enchained, was dragged into the square to the roar of the crowd. His face bruised, his long hair no longer combed and oiled, but matted with dirt and sweat. His eyes seemed to burn as bright with the inner fire that had once led thousands into battle. His name was William Wallace, who today, the 23rd of August in the year 1305, did not stand in the semblance of a defeated rebel, but as the spirit for one nation's struggle for freedom. Dragged through the streets to his horrific execution in London, the unyielding resistance of Wallace was met by the smothering power of the English crown. Born about 1270 in Elderslie, Renfrewshire, William Wallace came of age during some of the darkest days Scotland had known. King Alexander III died in 1286, leaving no direct male heir, thus sending Scotland into political turmoil. Edward VI of England, whose nickname was Longshanks because of his towering height, now seized upon that situation. Summoned at first to arbitrate between competing Scottish claimants, Edward soon laid his own claim to Scotland, making its nobles acknowledge him as overlord. But whereas most of Scotland's nobles now knelt to Edward, Wallace refused to. Little is known of Wallace's life before he appeared, by 1297, as one of the leaders of the burgeoning resistance to English rule. The personal tragedy at the start of his journey probably made him a symbol of resistance. According to one version, Wallace's wife, Marion Braidfute, was killed by an English sheriff, William Heselrigg, after which Wallace exacted bloody revenge. Whether the account is fact or myth, one thing is for sure. The hatred of the English was personal, the cause deeply rooted in a desire for justice. It was in the summer of 1297 that the crystallization of the rebellion of Wallace took place. His army, which consisted almost entirely of farmers and small landowners, clashed with a well-trained and heavily armored English army. It was not brute force that Wallace depended on, but cunning. Probably his most famous victory was the Battle of Stirling Bridge, which took place in September of that year. It was here that Wallace and his co-commander Andrew Murray met an English force that was much larger and much better equipped than they were. The English army, under the command of John de Warenne, Earl of Surrey, approached the narrow Stirling Bridge that was a strategic crossing over the River Forth. With cunning that would be etched upon the annals of history, Wallace waited until a sizable part of the English forces had crossed the bridge before making his crushing attack. The weight collapsed the bridge, and the trapped English troops between the Scots and the river were massacred. The Battle of Stirling Bridge was a turning point in the Scottish Wars of Independence. Such brilliant use of the landscape and Wallace's ability to outmaneuver a larger and better equipped force gave him the name Guardian of Scotland. Yet in all of Wallace's successes there were elements of difficulty, and his success at Stirling did nothing but enrage Edward I, who was quite determined to crush the Scottish rebellion. In the following year, he led a huge army into Scotland, determined to regain control. There came a crushing defeat to Wallace at the Battle of Falkirk in 1298. The English prevailed through numbers and lethal efficiency of the longbowmen. Wallace fled with his life, but shortly after resigned his commission as Guardian of Scotland. Although defeated, it was far from being a broken Wallace. His resilience became the stuff of legend, and he continued to fight in guerrilla campaigns against the English, never to accept defeat. But Edward's grip on Scotland tightened, and Wallace became a hunted man. Betrayed by a fellow Scotsman, Sir John de Menteith, Wallace was captured in 1305 near Glasgow. His trial in London was little more than a formality. He was charged with treason, to which Wallace vigorously denied, never having sworn allegiance to Edward. Charged with treason, a charge Wallace vehemently denied. As he had never sworn allegiance to Edward, he was sentenced to death in a manner befitting the king's rage. But even by medieval standards, the execution of Wallace was brutal. He was dragged through the streets on a wooden frame, his body tied to the tails of horses. When taken to the site of execution, Wallace hanged, but before death took him, he was cut down, his genitals severed and his entrails torn from his body. His head was set on a spike atop London Bridge, while his limbs went to the most far-off corners of the kingdom as an example to all others. Edward thus tried not only to execute Wallace, he tried to erase him utterly. And yet, Edward failed. Wallace's death only strengthened the Scottish cause. His brutal execution was seen not as the end of a rebellion, but as a martyrdom for a greater cause. The defiance of Wallace, even in the face of unimaginable suffering, etched an indelible mark on Scottish history. For generations, his name would be the rallying cry of resistance, reminding all comers that no matter how overwhelming the odds against them, the will of a people can never truly be destroyed. But one question still haunts the legacy of William Wallace. Was his death actually the end of his influence, or the spark that would ignite a greater fire in the hearts of those to come, including that one man who would eventually fulfill Wallace's dream, Robert the Bruce? The horseman thundered across the Mongolian steppe, his destination known only to himself. His mission was simple, but deadly: to kill Genghis Khan. It wasn't the first try at the life of a man who was to become the most terrifying leader of all time. Genghis Khan, born Temujin in 1162, faced death many, many times, in battle, through treachery, and even as a child. Yet time and again, he turned the tables on his foes and came out not only alive, but harder. It is this indestructible quality, the ability to survive where others would perish, that makes the rise of Genghis Khan, from obscurity to global dominance, so remarkable. Born into the Mongolian steppe at a period of intense tribal warfare, Temujin was thrust into the brutal facts of survival at an early age. His father, a minor tribal chief, was poisoned by a rival tribe when Temujin was 9 years old. With his family cast out and abandoned by their own people, Temujin faced a world where only the fittest and most ruthless could survive. By age 20, he had already tasted betrayal. Thrown upon the mercy of the Taichi-Ud tribe, he was enslaved and kept in wooden stocks. His life could have ended in such a deplorable condition had he not fled. Therein opened a wound in Temujin's heart from this early captivity. For him, this was a reminder that trust is a fragile thing, and power once seized can only be held with force. From then on, his life would be marked by an insatiable pursuit of power, interlocked by loyalty through fear, respect, and discipline that could not be broken. Temujin's road to Genghis Khan was paved with blood, unifying the fractured Mongol tribes into a single army under his command, unlike the world had ever seen. His army was the epitome of speed, mobility, and unmatched ferocity. While European armies trudged slowly across fields in heavy armor, Mongol warriors rode swift horses, their tactics revolving around deception, lightning raids, and psychological warfare. Genghis Khan's military brilliance let him subdue vast expanses of territory from the Great Wall of China to the Caspian Sea, all while avoiding the fate of so many leaders dying on the battlefield. But it wasn't just his military tactics that kept him alive. Genghis Khan knew the supreme role of intelligence and loyalty. He had a great diversity of spies reporting to him on most critical details concerning his enemies, and he surely knew how to turn defeated enemies to his side. When a city or tribe fell to Genghis, he often gave his enemies a choice: join his army serving him or face annihilation. Those who joined him became fiercely loyal. They knew serving under Genghis Khan promised not only life but riches and power. Despite this, the life of Genghis Khan was consistently rife with threats of assassination attempts, many coming from those closest to him. Some very dangerous threats came from his family. One such incident involved an old blood brother, Jamuka, a bitter rival who had been a childhood friend. Jamuka had once stood as the ally of Temujin in his quest to unite the Mongol tribes. However, as their ambitions clashed, Jamuka sought to overthrow him. Multiple battles were fought between the two, and Jamuka even attempted to assassinate Temujin, but fortunately did not succeed. In return, once Genghis finally captured Jamuka, he offered him mercy. But all Jamuka wished for was to die, asking only that his death not be in a manner that spilled his blood, and Genghis obliged. Even his generals were not safe from the ambitions of power. Probably the most shocking case of internal treachery came in the form of a general named Jebe. Said to be one of Genghis Khan's dogs of war originally, Jebe had tried to assassinate him. In one of the battles, Jebe had shot an arrow that hit Genghis in the neck, a wound that would kill most men. But Genghis pulled through, and instead of avenging himself upon Jebe for the injury, he felt impressed by his skill and bravery. He not only spared his life, but also raised him to the position of general, a decision which would be repaid when Jebe proved to be one of the most loyal and capable leaders in his army. How he could turn enemies into allies spoke volumes of his pragmatism and uncanny understanding of human nature. Yet, the dangers didn't stop at hostile tribes or perfidious generals, for Genghis Khan's conquest stretched from vast territories, each campaign slating a new peril. In 1219, during the Mongol invasion of the Khwarezmian Empire, Genghis Khan faced one of the most formidable enemies yet, Shah Ala ad-Din Muhammad. At first, the Khan tried to establish friendly trade relations with the Shah. The response was a lethal betrayal. A Mongol trade caravan was ambushed and its members killed. In return, the outraged Genghis Khan invaded in full force. It would become one of the most catastrophic campaigns of his life. The Mongol forces annihilated the Khwarezmian Empire, not before several attempts on the Khan's life by agents of the Shah were made. Once again, Genghis came away without a scratch. Though death was prolific around him on every side, even in the throes of battle, Genghis Khan had a mystical sense of timing. Fate and destiny were strong implications of the Mongol worldview, and Genghis was often regarded as a man protected by the heavens. He plunged into the very heart of the fighting line, leading his men in an almost reckless courage. But even enveloped by mortal dangers, he had emerged unscathed. Part of this was good fortune, part tactics, part the aura of invincibility that grew with every victory. By the time Genghis Khan neared the end of his days, the empire he had engendered as leader reached from the Pacific Ocean to Eastern Europe. His campaigns had killed millions and rewritten the political geography of Asia. But the man who survived more battles and attempts on his life than anyone could count was never destined to die in combat. In 1227, on a campaign with his army against the dynasty of Western Xia, Genghis Khan fell from his horse and received serious injuries. Some accounts say he died from his injuries, others point to illness. But one thing is for sure, he did not die at the hands of an enemy. The place of rest for Genghis Khan is unknown, even in death. His empire, which would outlive generations due to unparalleled violence and conquest, begs the question of what circumstances it was that led to his death. What force, if any, could truly have ended the life of a man who seemed impossible to kill? Subutai. In the vast and unforgiving Mongolian steppes, where survival often depended on cunning as much as physical endurance, there arose one of history's most formidable military minds, Subutai. As Genghis Khan's greatest general, Subutai led more successful campaigns than any other commander in the Mongol Empire, defeating armies across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. Yet despite his brilliance in battle and an unmatched strategic mind, Subutai remains a figure who operates in the shadow of his famed master. His legacy is one of extraordinary endurance, tactical genius, and the ability to survive both the rigors of constant war and the countless injuries that would have destroyed lesser men. Born around 1176 to the Uriankai clan, Subutai's early life was anything but grand. The Uriankai were a small tribe known for their reindeer herding and hunting, rather than their prominence in the fierce tribal conflicts that shaped Mongol society. Subutai's rise to prominence was unlikely, especially since he did not come from a noble or warrior family. His father was a blacksmith, a role that placed Subutai far from the elite warriors that filled the ranks of Mongol leadership. Yet through sheer determination and unmatched talent, Subutai climbed through the ranks of Genghis Khan's army, ultimately becoming his most trusted general. Subutai's genius lay in his understanding of warfare as a fluid, adaptable practice. Unlike many generals of his time who adhered to rigid battle formations and strategies, Subutai embraced flexibility and innovation. He would study the enemy carefully, understanding not only their strengths but more importantly, their weaknesses. His ability to maneuver large armies over vast distances in impossibly short times was a hallmark of his campaigns. One of his most audacious moves came during the 1221 campaign against the Khwarezmian Empire. Genghis Khan had tasked Subutai and another general Jebe with pursuing the remnants of the Khwarezmian forces across Central Asia. Subutai pushed his army over mountains, across deserts, and through hostile territory, never giving his enemies a moment to regroup. His army's speed and mobility were so extraordinary that it left his enemies disoriented and unprepared for the decisive blows that would soon follow. Perhaps one of the most stunning examples of Subutai's brilliance came during his European campaign in the 1240s, a series of invasions that left much of Eastern Europe in ruins. Leading a force of around 150,000 soldiers, Subutai devised a strategy of feigned retreats, drawing European forces into ambushes that utterly annihilated them. His tactics at the Battle of Mohi in 1241, where the Mongols crushed a much larger Hungarian army, revealed a depth of strategic foresight that bordered on the unimaginable. Subutai ordered his men to build a series of pontoon bridges over the Sajo River, allowing his forces to flank the unsuspecting Hungarians. Caught between the Mongol cavalry and infantry, the Hungarian army was decimated. Subutai's campaigns also highlight his ability to endure both physically and mentally. The long distances covered by his armies, often in inhospitable terrain, were grueling. Subutai himself would lead from the front, often surviving the harsh conditions alongside his men. He endured not only the extremes of weather, but also the constant threat of assassination and treachery, both from within the Mongol ranks and from enemies. Injuries sustained in battle were a common occurrence, yet Subutai showed remarkable resilience, surviving wounds that would have taken down other commanders. His sheer toughness became legendary, with accounts describing how, even after sustaining serious injuries, Subutai refused to withdraw from the front lines. What truly set Subutai apart, however, was not just his endurance, but his unparalleled skill in coordinating multiple armies across different theatres of war. In the late 1230s, Subutai orchestrated a two-pronged assault on Europe, sending Mongol forces into both Poland and Hungary simultaneously. He personally led one army, while directing the movements of the other from afar, ensuring that both armies struck their targets within days of each other. The resulting victories at the Battle of Legnica in Poland and the aforementioned Battle of Mohi in Hungary demonstrated Subutai's ability to outthink and outmaneuver his opponents on a continental scale. Even as his fame grew, Subutai remained loyal to the Mongol cause. He was not a man who sought personal glory, but one who thrived on the art of warfare itself. Unlike many generals of his time, who would often indulge in the spoils of war, Subutai lived a relatively modest life by Mongol standards, dedicating himself entirely to the campaigns he led. His loyalty to Genghis Khan, and later to Genghis's successors, was unwavering, and he played a pivotal role in expanding the Mongol Empire to its greatest extent. By the time of his death around 1248, Subutai had become a living legend. He had fought in over 20 major campaigns and won 65 pitched battles, an achievement few commanders in history could claim. Despite his many injuries and the unrelenting demands of his military career, Subutai survived long enough to see the Mongol Empire stretch from China to the borders of Western Europe. Yet even as his body aged and bore the scars of decades of warfare, Subutai's mind remained as sharp as ever, always planning the next move, the next conquest. But what, if anything, could have stopped this indomitable general? As Subutai passed into the annals of history, one question lingered. Could any man or army have truly bested him? Or was it only the passage of time that eventually claimed the greatest general the Mongol Empire had ever known? Hannibal Barca. Hannibal Barca stood at the edge of the Rhone River, his eyes fixed on the distant peaks of the Alps. Behind him, an army of over 50,000 men and 37 war elephants awaited his command. It was the autumn of 218 BCE, and what lay ahead of them was nothing short of unimaginable, crossing one of the most treacherous mountain ranges in Europe, with an army of soldiers, horses, and elephants, all while knowing that Rome, the most powerful republic of the ancient world, waited on the other side. For Hannibal, however, this was not just a tactical maneuver, it was a message. Rome would never be safe as long as he lived. Hannibal's story begins much earlier. Born in 247 BCE to the renowned Carthaginian general Hamilcar Barca, who had fought in the First Punic War against Rome. From an early age, Hannibal was groomed for leadership and warfare. His father instilled in him a deep-seated hatred for Rome, a rivalry that would shape Hannibal's destiny. As a young boy, he reportedly swore an oath before the Carthaginian gods that he would never be a friend to Rome. This vow became the driving force behind one of history's greatest military campaigns. Hannibal's invasion of Italy was part of the Second Punic War, a conflict that would last nearly 2 decades. The war was sparked by a series of escalating tensions between Carthage and Rome, primarily over control of the Western Mediterranean. But Hannibal's approach was unlike anything the Romans had anticipated. Rather than fight a conventional war on Carthaginian soil or attempt a naval confrontation, Hannibal decided to take the war to Rome itself, by marching his army across hostile territories and the seemingly impassable Alps. The crossing of the Alps is perhaps the most famous and audacious episode in Hannibal's career. It wasn't just the geographical challenge of traversing steep, icy mountains that made the feat remarkable. It was the sheer unpredictability of the decision. For centuries, the Alps had been seen as an insurmountable barrier between southern Europe and Italy. No general had ever seriously considered using them as a route for invasion. Yet in Hannibal's mind, this very impossibility was what made it the perfect tactic. If he could surprise the Romans by attacking from the north, they would be caught completely off guard. The march itself was grueling. As Hannibal and his army advanced into the mountains, they faced not only the brutal cold and steep terrain, but also ambushes from local tribes, landslides, and the constant threat of starvation. The elephants, which had been brought along as both war machines and psychological weapons, struggled to cope with the harsh conditions, and many perished in the icy passes. Yet, Hannibal pressed on, pushing his army through unimaginable hardships. By the time they emerged on the Italian side of the Alps, Hannibal's force had been reduced by nearly half. But they had made it, and Rome was now within reach. What followed was a series of stunning military victories that cemented Hannibal's reputation as one of history's greatest commanders. At the Battle of the Trebia, in December 218 BCE, Hannibal lured the Roman legions into a trap, using the terrain and weather to his advantage. His cavalry, faster and more mobile than the Roman infantry, outflanked the enemy, leading to a decisive Carthaginian victory. The following year, at the Battle of Lake Trasimene, Hannibal orchestrated one of the largest ambushes in military history. Using the foggy, marshy landscape to conceal his forces, He surprised the Romans, killing or capturing over 30,000 soldiers. But it was in 216 BCE, at the Battle of Cannae, where Hannibal achieved his most legendary triumph. Faced with a Roman army twice the size of his own, Hannibal executed a tactical masterpiece. He positioned his troops in a crescent formation, allowing the Roman legions to push into the center of his line. As the Romans advanced, the Carthaginian infantry gradually gave way, pulling the Romans deeper into the trap. Once the Romans were fully committed, Hannibal's cavalry swept around from both flanks, encircling the entire Roman army. What followed was a massacre of the 80,000 Roman soldiers who entered the battlefield that day. Only 10,000 survived. Despite these victories, Hannibal's war in Italy did not end in conquest. While he roamed the Italian countryside for years, his inability to break Rome's political and military alliances, coupled with a lack of reinforcements from Carthage, slowly eroded his campaign. Rome, though battered, adapted its strategies, refusing to engage Hannibal directly. Instead, they waged a war of attrition, gradually reclaiming territory and cutting off Hannibal's supply lines. But even as the tide began to turn against him, Hannibal continued to defy the odds. Hannibal's survival through countless assassination attempts and ambushes further fueled his legend. The Romans, frustrated by their inability to defeat him in open battle, resorted to espionage, bribery, and covert plots to take his life. Yet time and again, Hannibal evaded these threats. His network of spies, informants, and loyal officers allowed him to anticipate and thwart most of these attempts. Even as his position weakened, his presence in Italy became a symbol of Carthaginian defiance. In 203 BCE, after more than a decade of fighting on Italian soil, Hannibal was finally recalled to Carthage to defend against a Roman invasion led by Scipio Africanus. The two great generals faced off at the Battle of Zama in 202 BCE. For the first time, Hannibal was decisively defeated. The terms of Carthage's surrender were severe, and Hannibal, though still respected in Carthage, became a political liability. But his story did not end with Zama. Having survived more battles than nearly any commander of his age, and evading capture or death by the Romans for years, one might wonder, was Hannibal's downfall truly inevitable? Or was there still another unexpected chapter to unfold in the life of the general who had once terrified the mightiest empire in the ancient world? Simo Häyhä. In Finnish winter, when the snow is on the ground, sometimes in temperature below -40°C, he sat crouched in the trees. He was dressed completely white to camouflage himself into the snowy surroundings. Simo Häyhä lay in wait, his rifle aimed toward the horizon. His enemies christened him the White Death, but Häyhä was no ordinary sniper. He was the deadliest marksman ever to have walked the earth. In the Winter War between Finland and the Soviet Union, Häyhä recorded more than 500 confirmed kills in a period of only 100 days, which has never been equaled in the history of warfare. But it was not his accuracy or lethal efficiency alone that made his story truly remarkable. Rather, it was his extraordinary resilience in the face of unimaginable danger. Even shot in the face and left to die, Häyhä managed to survive and fight another day. He would go on to become almost a mythical figure in military history. Born on December 17, 1905, in the small village of Rautjärvi, Finland, Simo Häyhä grew up as a farmer and hunter in the rugged and isolated countryside along the Russian border. His early life, typified by long days tracking and hunting in the forests, would unknowingly prepare him for the role he would play in one of the most brutal conflicts of the 20th century. By the time he entered the Finnish army at age 19, Häyhä was an accomplished marksman, with a reputation for his uncanny ability to move in silence but with deadly precision. But no one could have ever predicted that this shy farmer would someday become the deadliest sniper ever. By the outbreak of the Winter War, which began in November 1939, with the Soviet Union pitted against Finland, the Finnish army was outnumbered and outgunned. The Soviet Union was manned by more than 1 million soldiers, with thousands of tanks and planes against the Finnish forces, who were relying on their perfect knowledge of the ground and using guerrilla tactics. In this one-sided warfare, Häyhä turned out to be one of the important figures, turning out very effective as a sniper. Häyhä's style of sniping had been as methodical as it was deadly. Without using a telescopic sight, its glass perhaps giving away his position due to reflected sunlight, he instead utilized the simple iron sights on his Finnish M2830 rifle. He would pack snow in front of his position to deaden the sound of his shots, and even place snow in his mouth to prevent his breath from misting in cold air, a dead giveaway of his position. Stationed in the forests and hills near the Kola battlefield, Häyhä patiently waited, often for hours and even days, for the shot that presented itself. The Soviet soldiers, by this time developing considerable trepidation for the White Death, would never see what hit them. By the time they knew they were under attack, it was always too late. As the winter months of 1939 and 1940 dragged on, Häyhä's kill count mounted as he continued his persistent picking off of Soviet officers, scouts and soldiers. He is said to have over 500 confirmed kills, but this is most likely an underestimate, since only the confirmed kills were counted. His presence became such a psychological blow to the Soviets that they employed counter-snipers and even artillery to take him out. They even sent entire platoons to hunt him down, yet Häyhä evaded them time and again, striking with deadly precision, before disappearing into the frozen wilderness. On March 6, 1940, as the Winter War neared its bloody conclusion, Häyhä's near-mythical career as a sniper came to a sudden and violent end. In a firefight against the Soviet army, he had his face shot off with an explosive round. It shredded the left side of his jaw and blew off most of the cheek and upper jaw. When finally his friends found Häyhä, they thought him dead on. His face was so mangled it couldn't be recognized as anybody who had ever lived. Amazingly, Häyhä was not dead. Excerpts of his biography describe how he was taken to a field hospital where he lay unconscious for many days, teetering between life and death. Häyhä would spend weeks in recovery, and it would take him even longer to recover the complete use of his faculties. The injury permanently disfigured Häyhä's face. Several surgeries attempted to reconstruct his shattered jaw. Yet, Häyhä's indomitable spirit was not broken in typical form. By the time he came out of coma on March 13, 1940, Finland had already signed a peace treaty with the Soviet Union, thus ending the Winter War. Häyhä was not only alive, but had outlived the war. Häyhä's survival from such a grievous injury was nothing less than a miracle. Still, the question remained: how could a man go through such extreme physical decimation and still be able to tell his tale? What kind of mentality made it possible for him not only to survive, but also to excel in the most hazardous and hostile environments? These are questions which have intrigued historians and military strategists alike for a long time. Häyhä himself, throughout his life, remained low-key about the feats, claiming his success was only because of his simple love of hunting and his country was in desperate need of defense. After the war, Häyhä returned to his farm and lived in quiet silence, speaking little about his wartime experiences. His legend lived on, though, and he became a living symbol of Finnish grit and resolve against all odds. Shot, disfigured and nearly killed, Häyhä lived deep into old age, dying in 2002 at age 96. But one question lingers. What was the driving force for Häyhä through the bitter cold, the countless battles, even up to the near-fatal shot to the face? Was it pure will, love of his country, or something deeper, more intrinsic to the man that would come to be known as the White Death? Horatio Nelson. A tiny, frail figure was standing on deck amidst a roar of cannons, thick smoke, and the intensive chaos of battle, that of HMS Victory. Wrapped in a welter of glory, Horatio Nelson, one of Britain's finest naval commanders, on October 21st, 1805, led his fleet into the decisive Battle of Trafalgar. Though little and fragile in his looks, Nelson was a whirlwind, a man whose genius in tactics and unwavering determination set the course for British naval supremacy. But on this day, his last day, the price of that legendary leadership was due in blood. Shot by a French sniper as he led his fleet in one of history's most decisive naval battles, Nelson would never see the victory he orchestrated. Nelson's career was based upon audacious strategies and personal valor, yet it was also punctuated by injuries that would have terminated the careers, if not the lives, of lesser men. Born in 1758, Nelson entered the Royal Navy at age 12, immediately displaying a natural aptitude for leadership and an almost reckless disregard for personal safety. He had narrowly survived several dangerous encounters at sea, including a bout of malaria that almost killed him while serving in the West Indies by the time he reached his early 20s. These early challenges were a mere precursor to injuries that would define his later career. The first serious injury Nelson picked up was at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1794, where an exploding cannonball threw dirt onto his face and blinded his right eye. Most commanders would at this point be taking it as a hint to step back from the front lines, but Nelson only became more determined. He proudly said, "I have only one eye. I have a right to be blind sometimes." This injury did little to temper his audacity. 5 years later, at the Battle of the Nile in 1798, Nelson struck a decisive blow against Napoleon's fleet, a victory that sealed his reputation as one of Britain's most valuable naval commanders. But probably the clearest glimpse of Nelson's character and his amazing ability to surmount physical limitations came with the Battle of Copenhagen in 1801. The battle saw the then Admiral Sir Hyde Parker, commanding the British fleet, raise a signal for Nelson's retreat. Nelson, who saw victory in sight, put his telescope figuratively to his blind eye and said, "I really do not see the signal." He led an attack and consummated a very important British victory. This act of defiance, the disobeying of a direct order in pursuit of what he knew was the right course of action, was quintessential Nelson: bold, unapologetic, willing to take extraordinary risks for the sake of victory. Yet Nelson's worst injury occurred during the Battle of Santa Cruz de Tenerife in 1797. At the head of a failed attack on the Spanish port, Nelson received a musket ball wound in his right arm, which shattered the bone. The injury was quite grave, and Nelson's arm was amputated in the heat of battle without anesthesia, a brutal yet common practice in naval warfare at the time. Within weeks, Nelson was back at sea, unbowed by the loss of his arm, rather more determined to win. Later he said, "The loss of my arm is a small price to pay for the glory of serving my country." Later, at Trafalgar, came the ultimate test of Nelson's endurance. At the eve of this great fight, Nelson led the 27 British ships into action against a combined fleet of 33 French and Spanish vessels. He knew that victory here would seal Britain's supremacy of the seas. His plan was daring. Instead of the traditional line of battle tactics, he divided his fleet into 2 columns and aimed to break through the enemy lines, trapping them in a chaotic crossfire. This was little short of a high-risk strategy, yet a stroke of genius. The British fleet would concentrate their firepower on the enemy flagship so as to sow confusion and collapse in the Franco-Spanish ranks. During the engagement, Nelson, resplendent in full dress uniform, strutted the deck of the Victory, issuing orders to his officers in icy cold, precise tones. He refused to cover himself and felt his presence would serve as an inspiration to his men. It was at this moment of exposure that a French sharpshooter, high in the rigging of the enemy ship Redoutable, took aim. He struck Nelson in the left shoulder with a musket ball, going through his lung and lodging in his spine. He fell right away, conscious that such a wound was mortal. Taken below decks, Nelson survived for several hours, still conscious. Even then, he asked about the outcome of the battle. "How goes the day with us?" he asked several times, anxious to know if his plan had worked. The news of British victory finally came to him. "Thank God I have done my duty," were his last words. It was a comprehensive victory. The Franco-Spanish fleet destroyed, British naval supremacy guaranteed for generations. But in its triumph lay Nelson's death. The man who had survived so many wounds, so many near-death experiences, finally fell in battle. His legend, though, was only just beginning. What was it that drove Horatio Nelson, this man always teetering on the edge of death, to go on fighting, to fight his way through pain and injury that would have crippled others? Was it love of country, pursuit of glory, or something far more complex behind this unstoppable drive? Conclusion. These are the stories of those who went inside the minds and hearts of men who had lived on the edge of death and refused to succumb to it. Their resilience is woven into the fabric of their times, shaping the history that followed. Be it through strategic genius, bodily endurance, or an unbreakable will, they all shared that rare ability to persist in the most overwhelming of odds. They made it through where others did not by accident but by sheer will, brains, and expertise. But even as their lives brought them face to face with the ultimate cost of battle, they each left behind a legacy that invites us to ask, What was it that truly drove these men to continue when death lingered so close? And as one looks back upon the sagas of these figures, a certain realization starts to creep into one's head. As great as their wars, strategies and victories were, it was, in fact, their indomitable spirits that separated them from all other great warriors. Be it the blood-soaked battlefields of ancient empires or the frozen forests of wars in the 20th century, these men fought not only against their enemies but against the very limitations of human endurance. And when their lives are recounted to us, they leave us with one question that continues to haunt us long afterward. Could the drive to fight, to survive and to lead have been rooted in something far deeper than we can ever fully understand? Thank you for spending time with us through Spookscope today. Feel free to share your knowledge and wisdom in the comments section. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share it with your friends and family. Until next time, my dear spooker, stay curious.